Morning. Good morning. My name is Kevin Fox. I am an AP teacher in Southern California, and I'm what I call myself a recovering We the People teacher. I had the great privilege of teaching and coaching a team for 15 years, and now I get to be on this side of the table. So I know how your coach feels. Fellow judges.
Good morning. Good morning, Nebraska. My name is Tim Murphy. I work at the University of Chicago, where I oversee the Master of Liberal Arts program. And also we run some programs for high school social studies teachers to do continuing education and that kind of thing. So I'm very excited to be here. Mr. Lindley is muted.
My apologies. I don't know, that happened when we went back to this room. Good morning. I'm Steve Lindley. I live in Cheyenne, so not a long way from you, and have been involved with We the People for 15 years or so. I'm a retired criminal justice administrator, and we look forward to hearing from you this morning.
All right,
Congratulations
students,
on getting
introduce
here.
yourselves. And
I'm Alexis Smith.
And I'm Kevin Rippey, their coach.
Kevin, all right. And we didn't hear the other students, so if they're muted, we'll want to make sure that doesn't happen so we can hear you. All right. If we're ready to go, I'll read the question and you'll have your time to respond. The American War is over, but this is far from being the case with the American Revolution. To what extent, if any, did the revolutionary principles influence constitution making during the founding period? What problems, if any, does the principle of consent present when creating or amending constitutions? And lastly, to what extent, if any, are revolutionary principles evident in modern times?
The American Revolution was a fight against the tyranny of King George III and the abuse of power that was demonstrated against the colonists. Revolutionary principles resulting from this war not only influenced but directly contributed to the making of the Constitution during the founding period. Fed up with Britain's lack of respect for the colonies, especially after the 7 Years' War, colonists wrote a list of grievances to the king, declaring independence from Britain in a document named the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence condemns taxation without representation, unfair trials, forced quartering of standing armies, and so on. The revolutionary principles in the Declaration of Independence proved to set a foundation for the future Constitution of the United States to a great extent. The First Amendment of the Constitution is all about freedom of speech, press, and assembly, many of which had been oppressed by the British government. Additionally, opposing taxes such as the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act and more, the colonists felt taken advantage of, and the colonists pleaded the phrase, "no taxation without representation." Amendment 14, Section 2 outlines the proportion of representation in Congress. The people are given the power to directly elect Congress members to create legislation for them and represent their state when deciding issues. Further, due process, which was violated by the British monarch, is an incredibly prominent right ensured in the Constitution, extending across Amendments 4 through 8. We see its prominence in cases such as Matt v. Ohio, which established the exclusionary rule, Gideon versus Wainwright, which established the right to an attorney, and Miranda versus Arizona, which established Miranda rights.
The principle of consent of the governed is a philosophical ideology that the government's right and legitimacy to use its power is only justifiable when the people being governed consent to it. America was just recently recovering from a tyrannical monarchy that ruled over them with methods that were not consented with by the people before the American Revolution. A big takeaway from how the Declaration of Independence influenced the Constitution is that the government should be based on the consent of the people. If the government strays from the wants of the people, it is the right of them to demand change, an idea known as classical republicanism. This can create issues because it can be hard to please every citizen when it comes to making laws. For example, when the US citizens were in the process of amending the Articles of Confederation and creating a new constitution, it was difficult to cater to the wants and consent of Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Additionally, in modern times, it can be difficult to cater to the consent of all people. Although elected officials are supposed to represent and reflect the will of the people, two main issues can arise. The officials don't necessarily have to directly reflect what the people want, as they are elected to make decisions for the people. Additionally, sometimes only a certain faction of the constituency is represented, because it can be hard to legislate for every faction in a population. Transforming our government at the consent and will of the people is a foundation of democracy and one of the many revolutionary principles our founders fought for. However, in such a diverse nation, lawmaking at the ultimate consent of all people is in some ways unattainable.
The Declaration of Independence is a reminder in our current political sphere of our right to petition and revolution. The civil rights movement, suffragist movement, and the very formation of our country were all actions with the intent to change a flawed part of our government. Furthermore, the timely and often criticized BLM movement is a perfect example of petition for justice and equality. It fights for the underrepresented individual and advocates for their natural rights as well as awakening the principle of consent of the governed. Even though this is what the movement stands for, many oppose it, but they fail to remember the very similar resistance that followed the Declaration of Independence and made us an independent nation. Our country was founded upon rebellion. The Declaration of Independence still plays a large role in our contemporary government because it precedents the citizens' right to demand change in our government systems. On the other hand, the Second Amendment is a revolutionary principle that our country still vehemently defends. The Founding Fathers emphasized individual rights, specifically adding the Bill of Rights to protect them. Nowadays, many people continue this, fearful of their Second Amendment rights being taken away despite examples of violence and clarity they often apply, such as 2017 Las Vegas shooting and the Sandy Hook shooting. They defend and resist efforts to limit their right to bear. Overall, the Declaration of Independence, the shining document of the revolution and revolutionary principles, cites the consent of the governed and how the powers of the government are derived from the consent of the government.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I'll start off with a round of questioning. You guys touched on the philosophical underpinnings of the consent of the governed a lot in there, and you did well. I wonder, in what ways do you think that the Electoral College helps or hinders the advancements of this idea of consent of the governed?
Ultimately, the Electoral College is a way for the consent of the governed to be established in our legislature on a national scale. Of course, we cannot have a truly pure democracy with having everyone vote and everyone decide and agree on one issue. Thus, electing people to represent the issue of the group, such as the Electoral College, is a perfect way to deal with that on such a large scale like the United States. However, oftentimes representatives, we give power to these representatives and they do not legislate to what the people who elected them, how they want to, so.
However, there are past cases that ensured that representation is equal when it comes to districting. For example, Baker versus Carr, which made sure that districting was equal so that every group, or I guess every state, has equal representation when it comes to the Electoral College.
One thing that, even though I do feel like the Electoral College is a system that works for our nation and has worked for hundreds of years, some issues can arise. One example of this can be Flint, Michigan, where many of the people there weren't really represented within their struggles because they had all their water issues, and their legislatures and like their people who are supposed to be representing them within the state level and the national level didn't really do anything for, I think, about like 5 years or so. And then even after that, nothing much has really changed. So even though it is a system that has worked and generally does work, it does still have flaws, and we have to acknowledge that.
You referenced factions in your essay, and of course, Madison wrote on it in Federalist 10. Can you elaborate just a bit on what a faction is, and does it, or do they impact significantly consent? So maybe kind of expand upon what factions are.
So the factions are basically the political parties that people tend to fall into, especially in terms of elections and who is campaigning for what. And I think oftentimes if somebody feels unheard, yet a faction represents the views that they have, whether it be Republican, Democrat, what have you, they can feel like they have a platform in which they can feel heard and represented within politics.
Factions, in a way, can also be just kind of demographics of people. So, for example, in the Shaw versus Reno case, we saw that they were districting so that African American people or people of color had better representation in their state. However, this was seen as unconstitutional because it really can't favor either demographic, even if it is supposed to be benefiting one. But the importance of factions is that Hamilton really emphasized is that they kind of even each other out. So when you have so many factions, they have to create compromise. And that's why he said that factions are necessary for our political system.
Very good. Thank you.
Let's go back to the sort of the real core premise of the question and this notion of revolutionary thinking. The war is over. The Articles of Confederation guided us through that, but they were not adequate for this new country. To what extent was the Constitution continuing revolutionarily, or was it like going backwards and being a little bit more conservative?
I believe that the Constitution was continuing this revolutionary stance because even though the Articles of Confederation were just this raw document that we had right after the rebellion and the Revolutionary War, the Constitution still has, as I stated in my prepared remarks, they addressed freedom of speech, unfair trials with due process and all that. It still accurately addressed the things that they were rebelling with the British monarchy and the wrongdoings done to the colonists, but it was more of a refined version.
One of the things that one of the biggest revolutionary principles was change, and the ability for the Constitution to change is really something that is great with our amendment process. And I feel like that kind of continues the revolutionary principles, as it allows for people, whenever they have problems with how the government operates, people can use their own power to contact their state legislatures, their national representatives, and use that to help change the Constitution. And I really do think that connects back to revolutionary principles.
In my opinion, I think that the Constitution built upon revolutionary principles a lot in, one, giving them more say on the laws that are imposed. They had the ability to vote. And then two, in court cases, for example, the Constitution 5 through 8 amendments are a lot about due process. And that was a big thing that in the article or the Declaration of Independence that they were fighting against, is that they didn't have a fair court system and the monarch could basically arrest or accuse people however he wished.
Let me try to, I'm sorry, Kenneth, were you going to jump in?
Go ahead, Tim.
So let me try to maybe tie both of these things, the revolutionary nature of the Constitution and this issue of the consent of the governed. Was the secession of Southern states in the lead up to the Civil War, was that justifiable under the concept of right to revolution and consent of the governed?
I don't believe that that was justifiable because of the stance they were taking for succession, which was the imprisonment of African American people. At that time, slavery was the reason the Civil War broke out and was eventually the reason the Civil War did so much damage and it led to abolition. However, because of, just because they were succeeding, it doesn't mean that
I guess one of the biggest things that stands out from that compared to the Revolutionary War was that when we talk about natural rights and how the revolution was about natural rights, the certain states were infringing upon people's natural rights, and I feel because of that, it totally destroys the foundation of what our Constitution was founded upon, and in that sense, is no longer justifiable because they were committing those sort of grievances.
Right, they were going against the common good of the whole nation and all people, whether or not those people were represented as people under the law. It was still going against the common good.
And that's a part of our principle of civic virtue, that in some ways we have to give up some of the things we want to promote the common good and to preserve the natural rights of everyone in the country.
Oh, perfect timing. All right. Wow, this is fantastic. What a good way to start the day. If my judges don't mind, I'll go ahead with a couple of comments. First of all, thank you for your work. I know it's been a challenge this past year, and I'm impressed with your overall knowledge. You clearly have put in some hours and some effort, and that is very evident in your work. I particularly want to point out, and what I liked, if I can read my handwriting, was the thinking about the notion of change brought up near the end, and the amending process And somehow, like, we don't need a revolution for our system to continue to work. We can tweak it, right? We can evolve it. And that's a lot more stable. It's stabilizing us. We don't need well, most of us don't think we need to go out in the streets and do those things. But so I appreciate the fact that you picked up on that. What you want to think about as you move on, because you have a round tomorrow, is when the question is particular to a topic, you want to try to really be disciplined. And the question about electoral college is particularly about the election of the president. And so you got a great conversation about representation and the need of not direct democracy, but we didn't really hear much on that process of selecting the president, particularly through that electoral college. So just again, for tomorrow, focus in, listen really strongly to the question, and I think you're going to do great. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo all of the praise, and also echo the point about the question about the electoral college being the primarily about the electing of the president. What I don't want to say most impressed by, but because there's a number of things to be impressed by. You guys have a real good rapport going 1, 2, 3, making sure everyone chimes in, and the amount of supporting evidence that was brought up, but brought up in the right spot. So it's, to me at least, it didn't sound like you were just rattling off things that you had memorized, but you brought them up in exactly the right spot for the right type of argument. And it was a diverse set of evidence. I heard a bunch of court cases. I couldn't write them down fast enough. A bunch of court cases, but then also some of the philosophical underpinnings of the question as well. And that was very well executed.
And I'll add to my colleagues' praise. You did a very nice job. I was impressed with a number of aspects of your presentation. First, I always like to say, great job and thank you and commendations for all of your hard work on We the People to get to this stage is an accomplishment in and of itself. So congratulations there. I too, like Tim just referenced and Kevin before him, was most impressed by some of your very reflective citations of both court cases. As he just said, didn't seem to be memorized. They were added in the right spot. Alexis had mentioned Baker v. Carr. I remember a quote from Chief Justice Warren, who said the most important case, and when you think about the expansion during the 60s of rights, was Baker v. Carr in his opinion. So that was impressive, as well as there were a number of other citations by all of you, and building upon one another's argument, one would stop and another would add to that. So nice work, and we wish you well as things move forward.
Good job, Coach.
Yes, and